Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sare. I'm Diane Sare, and as people know, I'm a Larouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate in the seat currently held by Chuck Schumer. I know there are rumors of AOC running for that seat, so who knows if I'll be challenging him or her by next November. Either way will be a lot of fun, and they represent, in a sense, the same interests, although he's obviously a much more senior spokesman for that. I'm joined tonight by Dennis Speed, who is the coordinator of Larouche's Manhattan Project, and Carl Osgood, who handles military and intelligence for Executive Intelligence Review, the news service founded by Larouche. Now, I had promised a celebration, but the clip I wanted to find of the chorus singing Chester was not readily available. So we're just going to have to look at this picture right here for a moment. And imagine, I don't know if this is exactly, well, what does it say here? The Treaty of Paris was signed today, September 3rd, 1783, where the king recognized the United States of America and settled upon the borders. And this is actually highly relevant for what we're going to be talking about today, particularly some of the freakouts coming from the city of London, the British Empire, over the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan and the ending of that 20 years war. And this is also the eve of the 20th anniversary of September 11th. And just, I'll announce it again at the end, but next Friday is September 10th, and there will be a concert being done by the Shiller Institute NYC Chorus, which I am involved in. So on that day, I would encourage everybody to participate and listen to that 9/11 memorial concert of the Shiller Institute NYC Chorus. Now, tonight, what we are going to take up is this question of why the British are so absolutely incensed, on fire, in a rug-chewing fit about the withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan and what the policy has been. And I had a conversation earlier today with Helga Zepp-Larouche, who said that one of the things that we're dealing with, where associates of Larouche are really unique, is not in identifying the problems of the world, but actually considering the solutions, how you address not only a crisis, but I would ask people to consider, what is the natural state of mankind? Is it natural for human beings to be at war with one another? Is it natural for human beings to not be concerned about their future? How is it that we have made breakthroughs to have houses with thermostats and temperature controlled and electricity and produce more food? Is that natural or is that unnatural? And I would assert that it is natural for human beings to develop. It is natural for human beings to gather in societies and to have a certain reverence for humanity as a whole. And that there is a tradition going back to Zeus and the battles of Zeus versus Prometheus, of an opposition to that by a few who cling to the perverse view that human beings are merely animals, and therefore there are some who are born to rule by virtue of strength or wealth or force, and others that are born to serve, and the way that you control people is by keeping them dumb, enslaved, and crushing their creativity. That is not natural. And what I wanted to do is look at an excerpt of a film produced by associates of Larouche with an interview with Helga Zepp-Larouche regarding the fall of the Berlin Wall. because it's worth reflecting. It's not only these last 20 years that we have had forever wars, but war seems to have been deployed or used as a weapon against this natural state of the development of mankind. And for people who don't know, when Lyndon Larouche was running for president in 1988, after he'd already been indicted by Robert Mueller, he and his wife, Helga Zepp-Larouche, made a trip to Berlin where they called for the reunification of Germany. And many of us in the United States at the time thought that this was really very peculiar. What was he doing over there? Why would an American presidential candidate be making such a proposal? Actually, it's October, I guess, of '87. And why did he know this? How could he? I mean, the Berlin Wall had been up certainly as long as I had been alive. Why would he say this? And he knew that the Soviet Union was going to collapse. He had forecast that actually 5 years earlier. And he made a proposal that in return for the unification of Germany, the West would feed Poland, which was on the brink of starvation. Now, that was very bold. A year later, the Berlin Wall was down. And a year later, Germany was actually officially reunified. And what Larouche said was that Berlin would once again become the capital. That's what occurred. There was a great moment of opportunity in 1989 when this happened, and it was missed because of Thatcher and Bush and an unholy alliance to prevent that potential. So I just want to review this and reflect about the wars that were set into motion at that point to begin to consider what has been going on actually in the world, how the United States has been used for several decades, because I think that will help us to understand why the solution to this is actually right in front of us and can be implemented, but we just have to change the way we think. So Jose, if you would go to that video, that would be great.
On October 6, 1989, Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev arrived in East Germany for the 40th anniversary of the German Democratic Republic, which had by that time lost tens of thousands of its people through gaps opening in the Iron Curtain. What had begun as Monday night candlelit vigils in Leipzig grew to include thousands of demonstrators across East Germany, filling the streets, demanding their freedom and the right to travel west. These demonstrations only grew stronger, and the people were no longer afraid to demand access to those inalienable rights of man that were still enjoyed by the West. Even though the Western system was crumbling under controlled disintegration, and the political leadership had become increasingly corrupt, elements of the West still maintained their constitutional commitment to human liberty. But after years of enduring the Soviet system, the people recognized that they no longer had to accept the conditions of that system, and they desired to be united with the West. In previous times, as with the revolts that took place in Hungary and Poland, the KGB and the military were brought in to round up resistance leaders, who in some cases were never seen again. Now, all eyes were on East Germany, the sole barrier between the West and the East, which was in complete upheaval. Would the Soviet military be brought in again to crush these demonstrations? Would the people end communism from the streets of Germany? Would this be the cause for another Berlin crisis? In the midst of this great uprising, a GDR minister announced that there would be new travel guidelines. The message was immediately misinterpreted and taken to mean that the borders to the west were now open. The border guards opened the wall and stepped down.
Did we lose the sound?
Yes, because it's copyrighted.
Yeah,
I think
okay.
we all have seen in recent days these extremely exciting moving pictures from Berlin. You know that the borders between East and West Germany have been opened. And the wall in Berlin, while it is still there, has practically come down. When this happened on the joyful 9th of November, in the first evening, 100,000 people immediately came over from East Berlin to West Berlin to taste what the new freedom would look like. Sunday, 3 million people came, and the stream has not ended since. Well, so also into West Germany, people came, they embraced each other, and you know, the people were so happy, and the West German people, they overcame all normal kind of behavior. They showed a tremendous hospitality. They opened champagne. They gave food. They invited people for dinner. People were climbing the wall from both sides. The Ode to Joy, the symbol of the fight for freedom, was sang on the most important street in Berlin, the Kudamm. And the Symphony of West Berlin played for free the 9th Symphony of Beethoven, and they performed 2 times the Magic Flute. Well, let me tell you, I think this is a genuine, real revolution. It's a revolution of agape, of love, of charity, not a revolution of rage. And as one woman from the DDR said correctly, Shiller, in this situation, proves to be the real revolutionary. And you remember the famous sentence in the Ode to Joy, all men become brethren.
The opportunity that Larouche forecast in his 1988 address had arrived, catching every major leader in the West and East completely by surprise. The moment had also arrived for the sane elements in the West to seize this opportunity and immediately offer their hand for Eastern debt relief, reconstruction, and growth. Germany, which had been divided since the end of World War I, was now in a position where under the right leadership it could resume its position as a leading power in Europe and the world. A historic moment that had not existed since German unification under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck was the immediate political reality of the time. When Bismarck formed modern Germany, he was wise to the imperial attempts to divide and control that nation, which had been successful for hundreds of years. To defend the integrity of the newly united state, Bismarck sought out Abraham Lincoln's top economic advisor, Henry C. Carey, who had aided fundamentally in the defeat of the British Foreign Office's Southern Confederacy and assisted Lincoln in creating the Transcontinental Railroad. The linking of that railroad marked a qualitative upshift in the ability of the United States to defend itself from British-controlled world trade and warfare, which operated through that empire's control of the sea lanes. By developing the nation inland, Lincoln actualized the long-anticipated hope of a continental nation-state. Bismarck, himself a Republican, saw those measures taken by the United States and knew that this development had to be brought to bear to advance the cultural and economic defenses of the German nation, and to root out those traditions of oligarchism that had poisoned and disintegrated Europe for centuries. This trans-European rail line, proposed at the same time Count Sergei Witte's Russia was initiating the Trans-Siberian rail line, meant doom for the British Empire. The only figures alive at the time to realize the vision of Lincoln and Bismarck were Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp-LaRouche. With Lyndon LaRouche held as a political prisoner for his collaboration with President Reagan on the Strategic Defense Initiative, the whole of his international organization rested on the shoulders of his wife. What she proposed was an economic science driver program to fundamentally reverse the Cold War dichotomy of the technologically backward and impoverished Soviet states and the rest of Europe. To build the base for these ideas to take hold among the population and leadership of these states, Helga Zepp-LaRouche led the organization into the East.
Well, we not only went to the DDR, or rather than the new states, where we literally distributed hundreds of thousands of such pamphlets. I remember that we went to the Leipzig fair, and a lot of executives from top firms said, this is fantastic, this program, but now the state is required. We cannot do it as private firms, but we need the states to agree. And naturally, this did not happen. So, we went further. We had many conferences, I would say hundreds of seminars and conferences, first in the new states of Germany, then in Hungary, in Poland, and later, naturally, along the whole Eurasian land bridge.
After years of the communist military buildup, East Germany was an empty industrial husk. Throughout the Soviet states, there was an incredible industrial potential, which the Comecon had suppressed by forbidding so-called Western methods in science and technology from being integrated into the civilian economy. The wealth of raw materials in the East could be easily utilized, but only under conditions of an accelerated program for the large-scale construction of modernized infrastructure.
Already at the beginning of January, we had the first pamphlet about our program, which was the so-called productive triangle, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, which was the idea to take this area, which has the size of Japan, and it still has, and had then in particular, the largest concentration of industry in the world. And the whole idea was to beef it up through modern technology, maglev trains, nuclear energy, other modern advanced technologies, and then bring it through so-called development corridors into the East. One corridor connecting Berlin with Warsaw, another one with Kiev, another one into the Balkans, and that way have a kind of a Marshall Plan for the development of the East. I don't want to use this word Marshall Plan, I'm just using it as a reference for a reconstruction program. If that would have been done, again, it would have been a completely different world. We would not be at the point of World War III now, but we would have, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed then in '91, and when we extended this program to be one for all of Eurasia, namely the Eurasian land bridge, this could have been the basis for a real peace order for the 21st century. It would have changed the East-West relationship in a completely different way, and it's a big tragedy that it was not used.
Great. Thanks. So what happened at that point is that you had a great opposition to this coming from Margaret Thatcher and George Bush. Specifically, they opposed the reunification of Germany. I'll never forget hearing H.W. Bush in his little whiny voice saying, "You won't see me dancing on the Berlin Wall." And rather than doing what Helga Zepp-LaRouche proposed at that time with this incredible moment of opportunity, and as she was describing, the people were ennobled. They really were in a revolutionary moment, as Shelley describes. The music of this revolution was the music of Beethoven. The drama, the literature was the literature of Friedrich Schiller. So the population themselves were ennobled. They would have been prepared to do something great. And what happened was a series of wars were launched instead. And Alfred Herrhausen, the head of Deutsche Bank, who was inclined also in this direction, was assassinated on November 30th, 1989, barely, not even 2 weeks after the wall came down. So what I just want to show you by way is a list. We're going to go through very, very quickly because it is actually quite extraordinary, the number of wars that were launched in the aftermath of this. Okay, we'll come back to this. This is Afghanistan, but here, 1989. So we had the Panama invasion. People remember, and it was really hideous, the surrounding of Noriega's palace, playing horrible rock music. It was really like the anti-Berlin Wall coming down. We had the Desert Shield. Remember, Kuwait was told by the ambassador, April Glaspie, or Iraq was told it was okay to invade Kuwait, that we wouldn't do anything. Maggie Thatcher organized it. We had Desert Storm. We had more wars under Clinton. You know, just, we don't have to go through all these in detail, but if you think about it, we have had war upon war in this period in places that most Americans can't even find on a map, against countries that never were a threat to us. None of these nations that we have had a war with have threatened the United States. So what is the policy? And the point was exactly divide and rule, exactly to prevent what would have been the natural impulse. And that's why I think when Helga heard of this potential of ending this perpetual war in Afghanistan, she said, this is something like the moment of opportunity of the Berlin Wall coming down, where perhaps you can change the paradigm. And I just want to go back just for 1 minute, just to show you the map, just so you, let's see if I can get this to reverse here and go in the other direction. Maybe I have to get out of this and show it again. But let's see here. We'll do it this way. Here. So you take a look at this, at Afghanistan, where it's located, the nations surrounding it. There's some very large nations around it. Pakistan is a significant nation. Iran is a significant nation. You have this little teensy border with China, which is where the terrorists, the Uyghur terrorists came into Xinjiang, China. You have Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. All of these nations, and not so far away up here is Russia, India, have an interest in Afghanistan not only becoming stabilized, but becoming a corridor of development and transport and trade between all of these nations. So how does that come about? And what is the potential for that? And wouldn't that be the natural course of things? And it's a very, very big challenge. I understand from various reports the Taliban were also surprised that they ended up controlling the country so quickly. And the question is now on them, how to bring order to this place and how to have real economic development. So I think we just lost Carl. Is that the case?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so maybe he'll get back in, but maybe in that case, Dennis, if you would like to say a few things about where we are, and then Carl, we can go back to some of the specifics in terms of the British.
Yeah, I think maybe the best way for people to think about this moment is not from the standpoint of its military implications, because actually its military implications exist in a completely different domain. Those military implications exist in the financial domain, exactly where Americans have unfortunately had the greatest blindsidedness and also arrogance. It's the same reason that Americans didn't really understand why 9/11 could occur. But where we are right now, as of tonight in Afghanistan, is in a better place than we were in a week ago, 2 weeks ago, 10 years ago. As one of my colleagues said, the danger, the fiasco, the incompetence was not in getting out of Afghanistan, it was in getting into Afghanistan. And the circumstance is that if you take the combination of the Afghanistan war, Libya war, the Syria war, and other conflicts that were fought, the so-called forever wars between 2001 and now, they've cost us a total of $5.48 trillion. So 2 billion plus in 2 trillion plus, in Afghanistan, and the rest is the other. At one point when President Biden was talking about this, he and others were alluding to the idea that if you were spending $300 million a day, that would be equivalent to what we were spending in Afghanistan. Of course, if you look at the United States today, and you look at the idea of what you should be doing in the United States today, what if you were making an expenditure, let's say, taking that 5.4 trillion of some 600 to 700 billion dollars a day on expanding not merely U.S. infrastructure in a general sense. What if you actually thought about the idea of capitalizing a program of rapid industrial development in the United States, taking nuclear power as your primary source? Now, this is an important thing to reference in terms of both Afghanistan and the United States, because with all of the belly aching about climate change that people claim to be doing now, those same people 40 years ago made sure that nuclear power no longer was developed in the United States. And some who were environmentalists then have changed their view in the United States. Patrick Moore was one from Canada. There's other people like Schellenberger. There are other people who have talked about, and Stuart Brand, people who were at the very forefront of the American environmentalist movement, who now make the point that nuclear power is the only efficient way from their standpoint to address the ostensible concerns of those who are concerned about what they keep calling the carbon footprint. Many of us, including myself, don't accept the idea that the carbon footprint is any kind of threat. In fact, carbon dioxide is generally not only good for the planet, but if you really wanted to temper the planet, what you would do is utilize that very production of carbon dioxide as a way of developing plant life throughout the planet with massive reforestation programs, which could also be coordinated together with various forms of hydroelectric and other projects around the world. But it is, in fact, also true that as a side benefit, if you want to put it that way, side effect, I would put, of the development of nuclear power, yes, you would have less fossil fuels and ultimately no fossil fuel burning. But that's not because we believe that oil is bad or gas is bad. We just believe that in order to get higher energy flux density, higher efficiency in making energy available to people all over the world, you go to advanced technological platforms. There's really no reason to have to burn oil or gas in that way. You have clean coal. You have ways in which to do something right now, which would be a crash program, which if everybody wanted to get together to do it in a kind of coincidence of opposites way, would solve the problems that the environmentalists say they have, and they would solve the problems that the world has in terms of the production of energy. The issue is that the ability to build, for example, floating nuclear power plants smaller reactors, which were modular, which were placed on platforms, either on water or land, to develop forms of agro-industrial complexes, nuclexes. This is a design which goes back almost 50 years. Lyndon Larouche talked about it and premiered it at one point in 1978 in a speech he gave in July of that year. Others had been working on these designs before Larouche, although the way in which Larouche put it forward was unique. So, but the same people that are today talking about the great problem of the climate were the people that prevented the building of any nuclear power plants essentially right after 1978 for many years. Recently, we've now had one or two built in the United States. And what's the issue concerning Afghanistan? The same crazy, wrong-headed thinking. We went into a country which was historically famous, notorious for defeating absolutely every other army that had ever invaded it. In fact, we went into a country in which we had instigated the then Soviet Union to invade that country, something that was done criminally, actually, by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Council advisor to President Jimmy Carter, starting in the summer of 1979. And that was done as part of a general destabilization of Southwest Asia, coming off our war in Vietnam. It's a longer topic, but what relevantly happened was the Soviet Union did invade. They were there for 10 years. It was a war that bled them to death. And as Zbigniew Brzezinski's viewpoint, not ours, that war was responsible for the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, if they were there for 10 years and collapsed, if we were just in Afghanistan for 20 years, what does that mean potentially for the United States economy? Well, not necessarily anything, but one thing we can say is that the expenditures in Afghanistan, the military expenditures in Afghanistan, and the military expenditures in the other wars were essentially totally waste. The idea that these things were required to prevent terrorism is given the lie to by people like National Security Advisor, National Security Agency former employee William Binning, who has spent the past 20 years demonstrating that he had built a system that was available to the United States that would have prevented 9/11 from occurring. And this is something that we just invite people to think about and to watch. The 8 days from now, on Saturday, September the 11th, we will be doing a special program which will visit this. And this will be sponsored by the Shiller Institute, and you'll be able to tune in and see various individuals who were both involved with 9/11 at the time and fought against it at that point. But I just want to say and be clear that the actions that the United States military took in Afghanistan were not in the interest of the United States. They were in the interest of Anglo-American finance. They were in the interest of the City of London and Wall Street. And they did have the effect of, as we just said, powering with to the tune of $5.4 trillion from the American taxpayer, the international financial bubble of the transatlantic system. Now, when that bubble collapsed during 2007, 2008, which let's remember was only 7 years after we had begun these invasions, inclusive of also the clearly criminal Iraq war, we failed to put that banking establishment and its military extensions under control at that time. We didn't take the actions, including the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, the shutting down of speculation, the shutting down of the derivatives markets completely, the orderly bankruptcy of those forces, whose debts can never be paid. We're talking about over quadrillion dollars worth of debt, which can never be paid. But we didn't do what we had to do. And we continued the year after 2008, when the Barack Obama administration came in. We did a surge into Afghanistan with 40,000 troops, and then it went up from there. And so the war policies that we talk about were part of a financial policy that, by the way, also utilized, very importantly, the proceeds from opium production, marijuana production, other illegal drug production, much of which was centered on Afghanistan. and was being essentially guarded, protected, and in some cases augmented through the actions of people in the British and American militaries. It may be an ugly thing to say, but it's true. It was done for the greater good and glory of the British Empire, particularly the City of London and Wall Street. Where we are tonight is in a very interesting circumstance. It's very much like that lost chance in 1989, and particularly what Helga Zepp-LaRouche was describing as she looked back on that day and that time, and what she was describing concerning the development corridors, and the development corridor going from Berlin and Vienna into Bonn, into Warsaw, and into Kiev, for example. You remember that she referenced, which is Ukraine. And she talked about the fact that you had more concentrated industry in that triangle area, which is about the size of Japan geographically. More skilled labor concentrated than anywhere else in the world. And that meant that you could have had a process of extended industrialization going east, which would have meant that what we're even talking about today in Ukraine, and what we're talking about in terms of the battles around the border of Russia today, the illegal, what should have been illegal, extension of NATO into those areas, and the provocations of Russia and Putin's Russia, even after we had been removed from Putin's Russia, which we looted, or not Putin's Russia, it's going to be pre-Putin Russia, from 1991 when it collapsed until 1998, 99 when Putin came to power. We looted Russia. Russia was losing 1 million people per year. So the idea that lost chance of 1989 not be revisited now in Afghanistan is right at the top of our agenda. We think that it's possible because of the Biden administration's own outlook. We think it's possible, not because it's a lot of good people in the administration, but because of their realism about the fact that they could not continue the war. Okay, so the question is, well, what are you going to continue? You didn't disappear from the earth. American influence doesn't just go away because one day all of America pulls all of its military out. You have a circumstance in which America's in Pakistan in a big way. China's cooperating with Pakistan in another way. You have the issue of Iraq. You have the issue of Iraq and Iran. There's no way America can actually extricate itself from that area. So what does it do? And that's the issue of the Belt and Road Initiative and the American involvement with it. That's the issue of picking up on Lyndon LaRouche's plans that he had for America and the development corridors that America could establish. And we have the opportunity now to do that. So I think it's a time for people to reflect on why changing your mind sometimes is not only easy, it's actually the best alternative all the way around, even if you don't think you know what all of the implications of striking out and taking a completely new strategy would be.
Thanks. So apparently, as you were mentioning, this fraud of climate change, Carl lost his electricity. So that's why we lost him. So another great benefit of the wonderful Wall Street bailouts that we've been doing over these last years and not funding infrastructure. And I'll say something about that in a minute. Let me just say a couple things about the British freak out over this. And it's interesting. I have to say that I don't fully understand why everything that's behind Biden's decision to stick with this deadline and to end the Afghanistan war. Obviously, there are some people in the military who want to shift our deployment from there to targeting China or Russia insanely. Biden's policy toward Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine is completely wrong and insane. But clearly, in Afghanistan, he got something right. And you can tell by the freak out of the British. Listen to this. This is from Robert Wilkie, who's a former official in the Trump and Bush, G.W. Bush administrations. And he wrote something for the national interest, which the Heritage Foundation republished on August 31st, quote, the US-UK special relationship after the fall of Kabul. And in it, he describes Biden as a longstanding opponent of the British, which I certainly had no idea of. And he writes that Biden is, quote, an appeaser of the Irish Republican Army for several decades. He opposed the extradition of Irish terrorists to Britain. This June, in a face-to-face meeting with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, he flabbergasted his British counterpart by not seeming to comprehend that Northern Ireland is a constituent part of the United Kingdom, not a province of the Irish Republic, unquote, Wilkie wrote. He then topped that performance by having his administration issue an insulting diplomatic reprimand to London and threatened to put a hold on a US-UK trade deal if the British government did not submit to EU demands over the Northern Ireland Protocol. And then he goes on to complain, when Biden decided to pull out of Afghanistan, he didn't bother to consult with our British allies over the timing of the withdrawal. He then refused to accept Boris Johnson's calls for 36 hours after Kabul fell to the Taliban. And then he writes, for 80 plus years, the US-UK alliance has selflessly offered a helping hand to all the peoples of the free world. Nothing in history compares to it, and Joe Biden is ripping it asunder, unquote. Well, for 80 plus years, I guess he's referring to since the end of World War II, actually, the alliance between the US, Russia, and China, which defeated fascism in Europe and fascism in Japan, had been reversed since Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, and you'd had a few presidents who took a different approach, namely Kennedy and Clinton to a certain degree on this Russia, China, India, and the US, Russia, China potential. And then Reagan's olive branch with the Strategic Defense Initiative. But otherwise, if you think of this series of wars, what is the great helping hand that we've been offering? Look at the nation of Haiti. Think about what the United States actually owes the nation of Haiti in terms of their relationship to our nation since the American Revolution, the hand of American system proponents in the Haitian Constitution, and the idea that people think that it's just somehow normal that when there's an earthquake or a hurricane, hundreds or thousands of people die there. It is not normal. And our treatment of that nation has been despicable. So, or Puerto Rico, which is nominally a protectorate of the United States. What is the economic development there? So this is a complete fraud, this great Anglo-American relationship. There's a reason why we had the revolution against the British Empire. And I think it's really up to us to ensure that what comes out of this is serious economic development. If you look back, and people might remember the program I had with John Segerson a few weeks ago on the history of Afghanistan in this entire region, where you actually had very advanced ancient civilizations with extraordinary aqueducts, with people, artists and sculptors who had been exiled from Greece, making their home there and sharing wonderful Greek art and sculpture. And clearly there's a long history in this region, which is actually part of the development of civilization, of human civilization. People don't think that way. Instead, you think that it's just this part of the world is a certain way, and it's simply not the case. And I would say that we impose upon ourselves what we impose upon other people, which is why we saw what we just saw in New York and New Jersey, up and down the East Coast, with the number of people who drowned in this tropical depression, Ida. And I would point out that in Louisiana, There were, I think, 9 deaths so far, unless that's changed, where the storm hit with full force. But after Katrina, they actually built a barrier. The Army Corps of Engineers was allowed to build a storm surge barrier, which actually worked. They had a problem because the energy grid has been privatized, like what we saw in Texas. So they lost power, but the storm surge barrier worked. We have built nothing in New York and New Jersey, absolutely nothing. We don't do dredging. We don't, I don't know, we've learned nothing since Irene or Sandy. And so you have the floods here and the death toll is at least 46. It'll probably become higher with people having drowned in their basements. So we should seize this moment as an opportunity to change everything. And I would say that also requires taking a hard look at what happened 20 years ago on September 11th, 2001, which Lyndon Larouche warned about. And he further warned on that day, he was on the radio at 9 a.m. Eastern time. I guess the first plane hit the first tower at 8:46 a.m. So he was getting on the show just after this first plane had hit. And with nothing more, no ability, he was on the radio to run and do extra research. He said, I hope they don't blame this on Osama bin Laden. And the radio show host said, what do you mean? And LaRouche said, Osama bin Laden is not an independent actor. And after the second plane hit and then the Pentagon was struck, LaRouche said, no one from outside the United States acting alone would have the capability to do this. Well, sure enough, they blamed Osama bin Laden, and LaRouche even went through the whole scenario about how one day we'd finally find him and kill him and say somehow we were victorious, except we didn't get any safer. The terrorism wasn't less, and we ended up in war upon war. And with the result of thousands of Americans killed in these wars and thousands more committing suicide in the United States. We haven't still to this day gotten to the bottom of this. And I understand that Biden is now saying he's going to declassify some of the documents. That's important, and the role of Saudi Arabia is important. But what Bill Binney and Kirk Wiebe and other whistleblowers from the NSA have said is that people in the NSA at least knew before the fact of the terror attack and were ordered not to say anything about it. And I think this does raise the question of the involvement of certain rogue elements in the United States. And that's what people have to be willing to look at. Cui bono? Who was interested in turning the United States into a state of perpetual war, the surveillance state, the idea of warrantless searches or being allowed to arrest people and not tell them what they're charged with, or the kind of thing that we see now with the treatment of the people who were protesting the election results on January 6th being kept in solitary confinement. In whose interest was this? And are Americans going to find within themselves the courage to get to the bottom of that? Because I think that is going to be very crucial on whether we're going to liberate ourselves going forward.
Diane, we have a question which comes from Ann in Jersey. Could you explain LaRouche's role in the Strategic Defense Initiative? You probably have to explain that, in fact, and the transition to the strategic defense of Earth and spin-off technologies that might be developed for peaceful development on Earth.
That's great. It's great because one of the things we've been talking about since this military-industrial complex has been making so much money on these wars, couldn't they make a lot of money developing the planet instead? Wouldn't it be profitable to build high-speed railroads and nuclear power plants? And of course, the answer is yes, it would. They could make a lot more. You lose a lot of money in war, don't you? You destroy everything. So somebody makes money on this end, but ultimately it's a very expensive proposition. The Strategic Defense Initiative, the idea of developing a laser technology which could shoot nuclear missiles out of the sky and prevent them from hitting their targets, was Larouche's proposal to ending Kissinger's mutual and assured destruction. And the point is, we didn't have the technology developed at that point, but it would be a science driver just as the space program was. So we were going to develop breakthroughs in laser technology, which would have all kinds of spin-off benefits in medicine, in the space program, in industry. And since you would upset the balance of power if one side developed it, the Cold War, if one side developed it without the other, Larouche's proposal and Reagan's offer to Gorbachev was that the United States and the Soviet Union develop this simultaneously. And the Soviet side rejected this. And Larouche warned at that point, if you go off on your own and try to build this without the United States, you're going to cannibalize your economy, you're going to go bankrupt and disintegrate, which was exactly what happened. Now, interestingly, the Russians have offered this proposal back to the United States in terms of not just defense against lasers, but or against nuclear missiles, but a laser defense against asteroids and comets, any of which hitting the Earth could obliterate, if it's a small one, maybe merely an entire continent, which would be devastating, but would have devastating effects on changing the climate or the planet as a whole. That may be what occurred 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs and about 99% of everything went extinct. So it would be very well worthwhile for nations to collaborate on a very real threat that could wipe out most of the life on the planet, which is figuring out, one, how to even spot the asteroids and comets that would be coming our way and how to reach them when they're at a great enough distance that a relatively small disruption of their orbit could offset their trajectory. So that, of course, would have the benefit of nations sharing their technology, working for something in the common good of mankind, and also potentially saving the entire human race from a major disaster. And we don't know how far away these disasters may be or how soon. We seem to be getting surprised an awful lot these days by asteroids and comets that were very near, and we didn't spot them until they were virtually upon us.
Okay, you have another question. This one's from Joe from New York. He asked this: what is your take on reports that President Biden has complied with the request by some of the families of the victims of 9/11 and ordered the Justice Department to conduct a review of classified documents related to the investigation of 9/11?
I don't know. I mean, I've heard that he's complying, but it seems like these documents are going to be coming out for the next 6 months. So I would take my cue from what the families think, if they're satisfied that he's meeting their demands. I mean, Dennis, do you have any other idea on this?
Well, I'd say just one thing, quickly about it. I think that one thing people are trying to figure out, Joe Biden, right? And try to say, well, how come Joe Biden is able to do this? And I think there's two things that people need to keep in mind. First, the presidency is not like any other office in the world. The only thing that comes sort of close, but it's of a different nature, is the papacy. That is that the kind of power that is presumably concentrated in the office is total. But of course, the papacy requires that that power be exhibited through Catholicism, a particular religion. And it's important, yes, because it's religion of about 1 billion people, a lot of factions, a lot of divisions. But when a person becomes pope, their identity is transformed. That's why the name is changed. So instead of saying Cardinal Montini, you say Pope Paul VI. Or instead of saying, Cardinal Bottiglia, you say John Paul II. And so that shows a person's a different person. That's the idea. And the office is dealt with differently. Presidency can have that effect on people that enter that office. It doesn't always have that effect. You've often had a lot of people who didn't necessarily understand that office and its secret mission. Sometimes that happens. Yeah, they remember something about Joe Biden just as a person, that regardless of what you think of him, he was in the Senate for 36 years and he was in the presidency as vice president for 8 years. And he also was from Delaware. And in the course of particularly the Vietnam era, and then in the Iraq wars and many other wars, some people know that that's where people bring the dead bodies in, right? That's where the body bags came. They all get flown into Dover Air Force Base. My brother happens to live close by there. He doesn't live in Dover. He lives outside, sort of around that area. He was in the Air Force as well. And we come from that area. Chester, Pennsylvania is about 20 miles, 25 miles up the road from Wilmington. And so the idea of the bodies coming in there, and you're greeting of course the parents, the family of the dead come there. There's an effect that has, and so there's something to be simply thought about here. Biden's generation is that generation that got drafted during Vietnam, or thought that they should fight during Vietnam. A lot of people got deferments. Some people got multiple deferments. But it didn't mean that people that weren't aware of what it meant, what the price was. The first thing just to say is that that's an important element to just consider about anyone who would have that background. It's not a question of whether or not that would or wouldn't touch them, but you also have to remember Biden's own tragedy with his family before he came into the Senate. The entire family was killed in a car accident. His wife, a couple of kids, I believe. So there's some things there that one has to simply remember about the person, because that person or people armed with the power of the presidency are not finally necessarily accountable to anybody except their conscience under certain circumstances. That is, that person can in fact act with that kind of authority. And so what you saw with this business with the withdrawal, in my view, when it comes to the question of 9/11, is that the withdrawal was what people say it was. Yes, it was chaotic, but why was it chaotic? Maybe he was opposed. Maybe there were people, in other words, that opposed Biden in the State Department, in the Defense Department, and so on. And maybe that's why it was chaotic. Because unless everybody is on the same team on something like that, after all, this is a war. There's nothing neat about war. It never works according to the rules. But the point, I think, is to think about it that way. Now, as for 9/11, let's remember what happened. The families of 9/11 said they didn't want Joe Biden anywhere near any ceremony that they were involved in on 9/11. And the reason was they had made a request that the documents as to what actually happened, especially those documents that pertain to Saudi Arabia and other elements, what actually happened be made known. And so what happened was that they made that very clear. And what has apparently occurred, at least from the reaction of one of the more prominent people involved with the 9/11 families, Terry Strada and others who made some statements about this, is that he has in part at least complied with their request. So what I think we're seeing is a presidency which, in fact, is it's sort of like what Martin Luther King said about JFK. JFK was not supporting civil rights publicly in any way. What had to be done is you had to go out and you had to do things that forced the presidency to respond. It is not the duty of the president, as people somehow seem to believe, to solve your problems. The duty of the president is to respond to your attempt to bring something forward and change a policy, and the president executes the law. So in the case of the United States, that's the normal way it's done. And what the families of 9/11 have apparently accomplished with Biden is what other people could be accomplishing, not merely just with Biden, but in terms of the American presidency as a whole. It's always like that. So I believe that the way to think about this is how the rest of us might utilize the insight that the families around 9/11 had as to the powers of the presidency and the way in which you hold the presidency accountable.
Great. Well, to that end, I just want to say a couple of things. As people may know, my campaign has started a newspaper, which is to organize the state and the nation, where some people get it otherwise. But the last two issues have been very pertinent. This one from August 20th, which covers our conference on the fraud of man-made climate change. It has an editorial, whoops, this way.
Yeah, you can see it now.
Yeah, that I wrote, New York is not ready for the next hurricane, proposing the actual storm surge barrier that should be built. And Dennis's report on the conference of the Shiller Institute on Afghanistan, actually before the troops all had come out, but Helga's very prescient initiative to hold a conference on that topic. And we just produced a special broadsheet on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. 9/11 was preventable, the enemy within. That's my editorial. Only facing the truth will secure the future. But it also features significantly, well, Bill Binney's work, but what Lynn was doing. It has excerpts from Lynn's interview with Stockwell here on that morning. There we go, you can see that. And it's, at any rate, I think it's really important because I don't think people say never forget, but what does that mean? And is it your intention that nothing like this should ever happen again, and that the United States should not be pulled into wars that are not in the interest of our people or in the interest of mankind as a whole? Our nation, after the American Revolution, had a real commitment to create conditions where other nations could be similarly liberated, not by engaging in their wars. John Quincy Adams was very clear that we would lose our own identity if we got involved in someone else's civil war, but by reaching out a helping hand to nations that wanted to develop, sharing the breakthroughs that we made in terms of the question of credit, Alexander Hamilton's work, things like the Transcontinental Railroad. And if we return to that identity, the world is really hungry for that. We could be the friend of virtually every nation on the planet, or we will remain the puppets of the British Empire as if the American Revolution never happened. And clearly what has been detected by some people in London is that for whatever reason, there's a potential right now, you see it in the Afghanistan case, for this administration to break from it. But I would really like to echo what Dennis just said, because it is for the American people to demand it, not sit back, passively and wait and then complain when it doesn't happen. I can assure you that the British Empire, the Great Reset crowd, the people running this global financial institution who want these wars, want this dictatorship, are not sitting back, and therefore we have to be active.
You have another final question, I guess, Diane, which came from one of our people down in Virginia. And this was actually something that came up last night. We never got to it last night in our Thursday fireside chat. And it goes like this. A central feature, Lynn Larouche wrote a program many years ago, actually half a century ago, called How to Lick a Depression in a Single Day. One of the things he said was he called for an immediate 50% reduction of the military budget and the conversion of the war industry to necessary production for economic development. Says NSA whistleblower Bill Binney recently called for an immediate 1/3 reduction in military spending. As long as the military-industrial complex spends, they will look for more wars to fight. Do you agree? And if not, what do you think should be done with the military budget?
Well, I referenced that earlier, which is the military-industrial complex can be converted to do what's necessary to do. But I think what you said is the point. The American people have to demand it.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. So that's pretty much it for our questions. I'll just say one thing about tomorrow on the Larouche Manhattan meeting. Harley Schlanger will be with us, and we'll be doing several things there. The basic idea we're talking about is that the American people, what we call the American System Rescue and Recovery Mission. And the idea was that once upon a time, people used to realize that the American economy was the greatest asset that America had. I mean, that's what we used to win the Second World War. We had a good army, but the best thing we had that nobody had was our economic power, and that we should return to using that rather than weapons. That's one element of what we're going to be talking about. Also, Harley will be describing some more about the British freakout, but we will also have, at least in part of our program, a tribute to the actor and activist Ed Asner, who passed away this past Sunday, and was in touch with the Larouche movement, and particularly the Larouche youth movement, about 20 years ago, and also often on it and in touch with us in recent years. So we will be doing that as well. We just wanted people to know that we're going to be taking that up tomorrow at our 2 o'clock. And then the following week on September 11th, the Shiller Institute will have a panel discussion on 9/11 and on this question of its preventability, as well as where do we go from here in Afghanistan. And there'll be a panel discussion, and the speakers on that will be made clear over the next day or so. But we do expect a few of the people from the National Security Agency and other persons that were involved that day are in that context to be with us. So just wanted to make sure I announced that.
Good. So just in case people didn't hear it at the beginning, next Friday is the concert by the Shiller Institute NYC Chorus 9/11 Memorial, and you can find the information on that at sinycchorus.com. And I would encourage everybody to listen to that concert, which will feature the Agnus Dei section of Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, which the chorus has learned virtually. I mean, it's frankly miraculous that we've been able to do this and put it together. And then there will be some parts of the concert that are live streamed by a small group in a very large cathedral in New York. So that's where we'll be next Friday. So thank you very much. Please sign up at sareforsenate.com if you want copies of the newspaper to distribute. And please donate generously to my campaign to defeat Schumer and everything that he misrepresents.